All right, let's get started. First of all,
I'll give it to you afterwards.
thank you, panel, for taking out your important day to come here and impart your knowledge and expertise on a very timely subject. Who would have thought just a few months ago that the idea of Bashar al-Assad's rule would end in a basically nonviolent way, and that we have a new president there, a Shara, who has turned from extremist terrorist to a elderly statesman. What's even more fascinating, as we just heard from Ambassador Crocker, that the president had met with him, and notwithstanding the fact that he has decided to lift sanctions through the act, I think it's called the Caesars Act. Maybe we could talk a little bit about that, and the waiver in that particular section, 7435, something like that. You know, there are a lot of deeper fault lines that the Middle East is facing, and I hope we're able to explore those today. A couple of housekeeping things. The way I'd like us to start is we'll go right down the line, take a minute or so just to introduce yourself and just a brief description of your organization. And then I want to ask you each a question to start off I call them the festivities here. I am a real big fan of intellectual tension. I think intellectual tension, if it's handled properly in a very professional way, can really dig deep into not only the fault lines that we have here in our country, but I think that's the first step toward finding a really long and lasting solution. So with that being said, I hope you're all in favor of mixing it up just a little bit. It'll make a little bit more spice and fun, if you will. And it'll also cause us all to dig a little deeper into our thoughts on this and, you know, how far we're able to move individually on some of the really pressing questions. So with that, Charles, let's start with you. I'm going to ask you the question, and you can then preface it by telling us a little bit about yourself. You know, you've tracked Ahmad al-Sharar's evolution from extremist to political actor. In your view, is it plausible that this former jihadist could be the man to lead Syria into the Abraham Accords? Or are we just falling for a strategic makeover and will ultimately be disappointed at the end?
Big question. I hope my microphone's working. So first of all, hello everyone. Thank you so much to the Council for the invitation. My name's Charles Lister. I'm a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where I direct our work on Syria. I've worked on Syria full-time for basically 15 years, pretty much 24/7 obsession. So I can go as deep or as high on anything to do with Syria if we want to today. And of course on a great panel of other friends and experts. Big and difficult question, which frankly I think I might write my next book on. Ahmad al-Shara is a complicated person. He wasn't born 6 months ago, and so I think when we look at how he presents himself today, we have to take into account his whole life rather than these sort of news headlines that so often grab attention. Ahmad al-Shara was born into an elite upper middle class family in Damascus. He went to one of the most expensive schools in Damascus. He grew up with a pretty unique upbringing compared to the vast majority of Syrians. He, alongside tens of thousands of Syrian men, followed the legal instruction of the then Assad-appointed Grand Mufti and of Assad himself, which was all young Syrian men of his generation were expected legally to travel to Iraq to fight the Americans in 2003. And as he describes himself, a young, impressionable young man, he took upon that both religious and legal duty defined upon Syria's young men back then in 2003. So he has that very controversial history. There's absolutely no question about that. He also spent almost the entirety of his time in Iraq in prison. Which is also, I think, tells us a lot about his internal character. He was imprisoned as a young and very junior member of al-Qaeda in Iraq, but he used his time in prison to politically and diplomatically maneuver himself up the ranks and put himself in a position where within months of his release from prison in Iraq, the Syrian uprising began, and he lobbied to be sent to Iraq. And as a relatively young and inexperienced young man, perhaps quite surprising that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi did dispatch him to undertake that role. He also, his presence or his persona that he's presenting today also wasn't born 6 months ago. When he declared his movement's break with Al-Qaeda in 2016, we then followed 8 years of gradual and methodical change. Now, that doesn't mean that his personal religious beliefs have necessarily changed, but his political agenda has unquestionably changed. I only caught the tail end of Ambassador Crocker's panel just before now, but I think either a question or a comment said, you know, that he was someone that we know nothing about. Well, I mean, to be blunt, and I know this for a fact, US intelligence and European intelligence have been engaging directly and indirectly with Ahmad al-Shara for several years now. This is not somebody that we don't know anything about, and it's certainly not an individual that we're inexperienced in dealing with. And so there is also that complicated and more muddied, mostly intelligence history. So we do come into this open-eyed, given his history, but we also come into it knowing a lot more than I think you would understand if you read your New York Times or Wall Street Journal article about Syria these days. He has a gigantic challenge ahead of him. There's no question that many Syrians are deeply skeptical of him and his agenda. One of the things that struck me most when I was in Syria in February, though, was that shortly before I had arrived, he had revealed his wife and his young daughters to the world. Now, first of all, if you are still an avowed member of Al-Qaeda, there is absolutely no way you would ever walk hand in hand with your wife and reveal your children to the media. But he had done that, and what struck me most was that Syrians all across the country that we were meeting with from civil society, many of them had pictures of him and his daughters or him and his wife as their screensavers on their phone. So I always draw a distinction a little bit between him and his movement in terms of how Syrians are perceiving what comes next. I think he has won a lot of favor over many of his very early skeptics and cynics inside Syria. I think his movement has more ground to make up in that respect, and clearly that will take a lot more time and also be presented with a lot of other challenges. And I'll end just by saying, and then I'll come to the Abraham Accords, by saying I've met with most of the foreign ministers from across the region over the last 6 months, and what's really struck me was that every single one of them who has now met Ahmad al-Shara over the last 6 months said something along the lines of, I walked into the meeting full of skepticism and cynicism with my guard up, and I came out awed. That's not my words, that is literally the words I've heard from basically every foreign minister in the region. That he was widely, well-read, intelligent, pragmatic, and seemed to know what he needed to do to accomplish the task of transitioning in post-conflict Syria. So again, that's not my vote of confidence, but it is what I have heard from those who are now trying to work hand in hand with him to move Syria forward. Abraham Accords, Syria is not going to be joining the Abraham Accords anytime soon. Syria already was part occupied by Israel before Assad fell. 220 square kilometers of additional territory have been occupied by Israel since. So there's going to be no normalization of ties with Israel until that issue of territorial occupation is fixed. We've also seen 819 Israeli air and artillery strikes in Syria over the last 6 months, 193 ground incursions, and in that same 6-month period, 0 attacks from Syria. So there is a significant imbalance in the current dynamic between these two entities. And again, that imbalance needs fixing before any Syrian government will consider normalizing their ties with Israel. So that's where we've got tracks of engagement between Israel and Syria, mediated by the UAE, and we've got another one between Azerbaijan and Turkey around deconfliction that also includes a Syrian kind of deconfliction and confidence building track. Those kinds of processes will help to build confidence and break down barriers of distrust, but we have a long way to go before I think we're going to see Ahmad al-Shara signing the book of the Abraham Accords. But unquestionably, he wants a better and a good and peaceful relationship with Israel. I think he's made that very clear since day one, and he's been very pragmatic and calm in the face of Israel's military actions.
Thank you very much. Dani, nice to meet you. I did a little reading on you, and I understand that you're a bit hawkish in your view, which I think is really good. And so, after you've introduced yourself, is this a bold diplomatic move by President Trump, or is it dangerous naivety?
Thank you. Don't believe anything you read about me, and really, and thank you. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces. Thank you, Philip, for including me, and it's great to be with all of you. You know, look, I'm not going to give you the answer that satisfies your desire for a lively argument on the panel for a very simple reason. I think we don't know the answer to the question that you posed, and Charles laid it out perfectly. We don't know. Let me talk a little bit about Syria, which is one of my most beloved countries in the region, and then a little bit about Donald Trump. On the question of Syria, you know, look, we learned this with Iraq. You don't come out from under decades and decades of absolutely torturous, brutal dictatorship. Now, nobody gave a damn about the Assad regime murdering 500,000 people, exiling millions of people, chemical weapons violations, nuclear weapons violations, partnership with Iran, yada, yada, yada. But the Syrian people lived with that. And so the idea that somehow, you know, one man, whether he was a member of Al-Qaeda or frankly, a member of Congress, would be able to deliver a peaceful, compliant Syria is not. It's just not true. It's outside the realm of reality. I think another thing that we learned in Iraq, and I think that we, again, particularly people, let me sort of slam my own generation and leave out people who are a little bit younger and who have yet to make these same mistakes, but undoubtedly will. You are trapped in your generational analysis. That's very, very much a problem in our world of Washington think tanks and frankly of diplomacy as well. And so we see Syria the way that we met Syria, the way that we knew Syria. And the reality is that if you are educated in a fundamentally totalitarian system, and it is you, your children, your parents, and your parents' parents, you sign up to the ideas that you are taught, even if your inner soul understands these are bad people. These are not my ideas. That, you know, the supremacy of the Alawites and our partnership with Iran is actually a bad thing. The reality is that itself is almost impossible to overcome in a quick, let's say, in a rapid-fire way. And you know, in the place of, you know, when there are massive sanctions still in place, when the neighbors are full of doubt, rightly full of doubt, I should say, for both Israel and Lebanon, then one guy isn't going to do it, as much as we in America love one guy, because we always love one guy. So I would sort of put that as a really important a caveat in how we think about Syria, and that's why, you know, dunno is the right answer, you know, and it's not trust but verify, it's verify and then trust. So the problem for us is the question of why Donald Trump made this decision. And of course, I think all of us have a sneaking suspicion of why he made this decision. He made this decision because the Qataris and the Emirates and maybe the Saudis asked him to. And that's a really bad reason to do almost anything, as much as I like some of them, and decidedly not all of them. Here's the issue for the Trump administration's decision making. President doesn't give a damn about Syria. Okay, I think that's fine. Most presidents don't give a damn about Syria, and why should they, after all? But he's doing what our putative partners in the Gulf are asking him to do, and he's going to let them carry the weight of ensuring that, in fact, they weren't lying to him when they said, you can trust this man. That's all. That's how, there's never anything more complicated here. And Donald Trump told us this repeatedly in his first term, and I believe it for his second term as well, which is, his attitude is, you do you, right? If you do something bad and I'm mad at you, I'll punish you. But right now I'm not mad at you, so you seem okay, and maybe you handed me some emoluments, and to use the constitutional term, and so okay, yeah, benefit of the doubt, right? That's it. The problem with that is that is that a passive policy of tolerance and allowing, God, heaven forfend, the Qataris to be the stewards of Syria's evolution seems to me to be a really crap idea. And that's the problem, of course, with this administration. They're not interested. They're fine if Syria wants to evolve. They don't want to stand in their way, but they're not actually going to do anything to be helpful in this regard. And so where Syria ends up going will be, thanks to the kind leadership of our friends in either Ankara or in Doha. And yeah, those guys suck, to use the diplomatic expression. My last point about this is one that's really nerdy, but you're all retired, so let's be nerdy. This whole question of Syria raises the perennial but really interesting debate that we have in Washington, and there are no partisan pieces of this. This is really a philosophical debate about whether Islamists can become Democrats, small d. And it's a very, it pits, for example, people like me who believe that the answer to that is yes, against my friends, for example, at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and we're all pretty good conservatives, we're all pro-Israel, we all do not like Al-Qaeda or HTS. But this philosophical question is hugely important, because if we are not going to be in the business of helping to shepherd countries towards democratic freedoms and market economics, and decidedly we're not, because the president told us that neocons are horrible people. Thank you, Mr. Trump. And so we are going to therefore allow this to happen and see where it goes. And this is not a small debate, and it deserves much, much more concentration, much, much more thinking, and much, much more work with people like Ahmed Ashara to actually understand whether there's a real prospect to move forward with people who are or were Islamists and have grown up. Because there is a growing up to be done, and it's not impossible. So I think that's a really interesting debate, and that's where I'm going to end.
Well, great. And I just want to
Sorry for not being super hawkish.
No, that's great. I just want to plant the seed with you, so we'll talk about it after we go down the line, and just think about, does that mean Islam has to go through a reformation? Okay, so let's just park that for a minute, and let's move on to Henri. You're an expert on Turkish foreign policy, and I want to enter a new actor, a new player into this whole scheme of things, and that's Turkey. And if you could just give us a little bit of background about yourself and the Council on Foreign Relations, and then get into how does Turkey play a significant role in this whole debate today.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I just retired from being a professor of international relations at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, and I'm now an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, not far away from here, as you know. Yes, Turkey. The fall of the Assad regime was seen as a great victory for Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, and since then, the lifting of the sanctions on the new Syrian government was also seen as a great victory for Erdogan, especially because he was in the room by telephone when all this happened, when Trump met Shara, but he had been pushing very hard for the sanctions to be relieved. But of course, it's interesting in a sense that Shara came to power just when Erdogan was also trying to get in touch with Assad. As you know, since the Arab Spring, Turkey, quite rightly so, went after Assad and broke diplomatic relations and supported all types of people fighting Assad. Also admitted something like 3.5 million refugees, the largest number of refugees in any one country, and progressively also increased its influence in northern Syria. But then, starting in 2014, early 2014, Erdogan decided to change his foreign policy, which had excluded the likes of Sisi in Egypt. He had once said, I will never shake that man's hand. And yet, in 2024, he went all the way to Cairo and shook Sisi's hand. And he wanted Assad to connect with Assad too. And Assad said, I won't shake your hand, so to say, until you get out of my territory. Because Turkey now, in fact, occupies, depending on how you count it, 2,800 to 4,000 square miles of territory in Syria. This is as big as Lebanon, actually, if you were to compare. And Erdogan had no intention of leaving Syria, and therefore that never came into, then they could never, so to say, shake hands, and then Assad obviously lost power. Now, to me, the fall of Assad came as a shock to Erdogan as much as to anybody else, and I suspect that even if they knew about the HTS operation against Aleppo, they probably never thought that the HTS would make it all the way to Damascus. I don't know. Charles would know this better than me. Maybe Erdogan pushed the HTS just to get a little bit of leverage on Assad. But that's now tempo passato, as the Italians would say. However, the issue now for Turkey in Syria is essentially threefold. But until the overthrow of Shara, it was just two issues. One, the refugee problem. Yes, the Turks admitted a large number of refugees, and some of the refugees, by the way, did very well in Turkey, opened businesses, integrated, but there was also a backlash in certain parts of Turkey, and that was becoming an electoral issue for Erdogan, just like here. I mean, it's not different in some ways. But so he was looking at, he wanted Assad to be overthrown, he wanted Assad to start taking back refugees. Some of the military operations that were done in northern Syria had the intention of pushing some of the Syrian refugees into these enclaves. That didn't work. But the most fundamental reason Erdogan is interested in Syria, and to this day, is the question of the Kurds, as was mentioned by Ambassador Crocker and Charles, I think. Look, the Syrian Democratic Front, which today is the most powerful military force in Syria, let's face it, is twice or three times as large as HTS. Not that we know exactly how many HTS folks there are, but it is also a well-armed and well-trained and quite effective force. The Syrian Democratic Forces, as you know, aligned with us to fight ISIS, and they were the only ones who managed to beat ISIS. When ISIS took over the whole territory, they just made mincement of everybody came up against them. And the Syrian Democratic Forces, we sometimes forget this, lost something like 11,000 people in the fight against ISIS. But for Erdogan, the presence of ISIS, the presence of the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Force, is truly an existential threat. It is an existential threat not because the SDF or the YPG's main component part is an affiliate of the PKK, was created by the PKK, yes, decades ago, and has some of the same ideological imprints, if you want, of the PKK. It is actually quite, in terms of execution, in terms of planning, it is actually quite independent of the PKK. The PKK, anyway, is a spent force. We can talk about that in the next round. But the problem is not that it's a PKK. It could be the most benevolent Islamic or even whatever national organization in Syria that controls that kind of territory, it will still be an existential threat. Why? All you have to do, is, those of you who worked on Iraq all these years, remember what happened in Iraq. In Iraq, Saddam went after the Kurds. You will remember those days well. And eventually, we intervened, and now there is a federal state in Iraq, right, with the Kurds. The Kurds are officially recognized. So what Erdogan is afraid of, and a lot of Turks are afraid of, and they talk about the SDF being terrorists, etc., which they haven't, the SDF never attacked Turkey, is because they're afraid that we're going to do the same thing again. That we are going to intervene and Syria is going to be a federal state. I don't think we have anything against federalism last time I checked here in the United States, but for the Turks, that means who's next? That they will do in a conspiratorial mind that they have, they think that we will also do the same thing in Turkey, we'll create a federal state for the Kurds in Turkey. At the very least, it will create, the creation of a federal arrangement in Syria will give a new oomph, if you want, to Kurdish, I wouldn't say independence forces in Turkey, but to Kurdish nationalism. So this is what he wants to stop, right? And so that's what he has tried to do. That's what he actively fought the SDF directly and indirectly. The Turks control something called the SNA, the Syrian National Army, which is composed of lots of brigades, many of them really awful people, jihadists. And its only purpose of the SNA is to attack the SDF, which at the same time is supposed to maintain the prisons where the Al-Qaeda, the ISIS folks are, and also continuously to fight ISIS. So this is actually a really very, very difficult problem. And Erdogan is very unlikely to give up on trying to, shall we say, erase any notion of any sort of, forget about federation, but autonomy for the Kurds in Syria. Now, the one amazing thing that has happened recently is that the SDF and the Kurdish National Council, which was the more conservative Kurdish group in northern Syria that was not very big, but was supported by the KDP in Iraq or in the KRG, those two would never collaborate on anything. Now they formed an alliance, and they formed an alliance. They had a big meeting in Kamishli last month. Even Barzani's people sent delegations, and they came out with a statement, very surprising, asking technically federation, although the STF doesn't commit itself to a federation. The point is that drove Erdogan bananas. He said Syria cannot become a federation. Sorry, if the Syrian people decide, it's not your choice. But this is the most important issue for Erdogan. Of course, the third aspect is he wants to, and now that Shara is there, and he wants to be kind of or at least maybe he sees himself as the officially sanctioned predator for Syria. I mean, he's the 800-pound gorilla in the north of Syria. Turkey is, relatively speaking, is a rich country with a significant manufacturing capacities, can do a lot of good for Syria, but that is also may turn out to be a problem, and Charles will know better, but I don't know how much Shara wants to be Erdogan's little go-man in Syria. So I suspect that Shara is going to try, as we saw with these first steps of Saudi Arabia, try to balance it out. But this is only the beginning of a very complex set of events, and the PKK thing also will complicate. I'll mention it later.
Thank you very much. Qutaiba, you get the answer to the question about the actual Syrian society. You're an expert in this, and we've talked a lot about the leadership and the policy issues, but what about the social issues, the society itself? the Syrians who have suffered so greatly. So just introduce yourself and
Sure.
your organization, and please give us your insight into all of the issues that Syrian society is facing today.
Sounds great. First, thanks for having me. Thanks to the council, to all of you to be here. My name is Qutaiba Idlbi. As the name tells, originally from Idlib, but actually my family comes from the Barazi tribe, one of the largest Kurdish tribes actually that moved to Syria in the early 1800s from Kermanshah in northern Iran. I think we are the largest by far, around 1.5 million Barazis and their subfamilies and clans within and around Syria. In the more recent history, I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. I lead the council's work on Syria, a little bit on Jordan and Lebanon. I've been in Washington for the last 12 years, since 2013. And I've been in the policy development circles since then. I've worked alongside the Department of Defense, the Department of State, and more recently with the Atlantic Council. Of course, going back to Syria, I think definitely Syrians are going through, this is probably our third or fourth republic in a sense. After Assad escaped, basically, we inherited the country with all of the problems that the Assad family has created since 1963 or 1970. So there are so many issues that I think the Syrians are dealing with when it comes to sectarianism, when it comes to how the country needs to be governed. I think the number one challenge that we're really seeing comes to transitional justice. President Shara, in his first public interview, he said, he was asked, what about transitional justice? What are you doing to bring justice to Syrians? And he said, we brought you the country back, and this is your justice. In a sense, the fact that Syria was able to move forward, the fact that Syrians own their country back, basically, that was the most important part of the process as he defined it. It doesn't mean that there will not be like a process, but basically he wanted to tell people, focus on what you have rather than focus on trying to get justice or revenge for previous crimes and injustices. But in a sense, what that did, it kind of created a threshold. So for the majority of Sunnis of Syria who've been the major victim of oppression, of injustices in Syria for the last 60 years, at least since 1963, or at least since 1970 when Assad took over, it meant that they were okay with the fact that they got their country back as a majority, but it also meant that this is the threshold when they feel the country is threatened, the country that they got back is threatened. That is when they would move to get their justice on their own hands. And I think that's where we see kind of like those fracture lines between different communities. So when we saw a movement by former Assadists in the coast, basically to try, to take over the coastal region in Latakia and Tartus, which is almost the size of Lebanon, and basically bodies of security forces from Idlib and other places started to arrive. People in Syria were not saying, this is like an Alawi insurgency. They were not saying this is just a small security problem. They were saying this is a coup. And it was a very similar moment to the coup moment in Turkey back in 2016, basically, when there was all of that, self-mobilization in a sense, and people going out to the street. Shara didn't come out to the media to tell people, hey, you need to come out, but basically everyone felt that they need to go to the coast, basically, to defend the country that Shara gave them back. So that kind of became a defining moment, and in a sense, it became a challenge for both Syrians and the government. Because the government found itself in a place where it defined that threshold, and it had to basically defend it. When it told Syrians, we got you the country back, it meant that the government needs to do everything it can to protect that country, basically, that it gave back to Syrians. So we see those both political and ethnic and sectarian fracture lines with the Alawis in the coast because of former regime affiliates who are trying to instigate a coup or an insurgency. We see it with the Druze again, not because it's only sectarian, because it's political, because it started with former regime militias and affiliates who are also trying to start an insurgency. But surprisingly, for example, we don't see it with the SDF. Like, we haven't seen, despite the different confrontations that happened, despite so many failed, like, for example, agreements in the last month or so between the government and the SDF about Jashrin Dam, we haven't seen self-mobilization across the country from, different communities to go fight, the SDF in Northeast. And so there is no that defining moment, not because, in a sense, it was seen as, oh, this is an Arab or Sunni area, or this is an Arab or Sunni force, but because it's not seen as a pro-Assad force. And that's why, there's no that sense that, it's a threat to the national country. It is a problem that needs to be dealt with, but it's not an existential threat. So I think this is one issue that Syrians will need to deal with. How can they make sure that basically those political fracture lines and sectarian fracture lines that are overlapping right now are separate, and the focus continues to be on the political ones and try to heal actually the ethnic and sectarian fracture lines that the Assad regime created. I think otherwise there is, definitely a challenge of what would be the future of democracy in the country. Not a challenge because the existing authorities necessarily, but it's a challenge of time, because right now the question is, do you try to kind of divide the cake among the different parties, pushing the country, as the government at least sees it right now, to be more like Iraq, like Lebanon after the war, which is something the government is saying we're absolutely not going down that route. We're not gonna, there's no cake to be divided. We're not gonna, do political participation by bringing all the warlords into the government, basically, and have permanent position there. But also, so you have that issue of how can you create political participation on the short term, but also there is a question of stability. Yes, I think we have seen how nonviolent, as you described it, this transition was. But let's be very blunt about it. What we've seen on December 8th was a complete state collapse. The security, the army, there wasn't a de-Baathification process, but the Ba'ath and people who are affiliated with the regime, they self-de-Baathified. They were like, we're dropping our arms, our uniforms, everything in the street. I'm from Damascus, and I remember in the early days I was working with local coordination committees, and the number one task was just to collect weapons from 12, 13, and 14 years old in the street. Because Damascus was, and this is the capital where you don't see a lot of weapons. In every single corner, you can see a bunch of guns thrown around the corner. That was a mess in Damascus just in the first month, because literally you can see kids carrying weapons that they found on the side of the street, that the intelligence, the military left there. So the country has survived, I think, because there is a high level of discipline among Syrians. I think Syrians, on one hand, they were tired of the war, but I think there was a genuine joy and appetite to really preserve the country and to kind of show that, yes, this is not Libya, this is not Iraq, this is not Lebanon. And that continues to be the case. But again, let's not kid ourselves. There is a big task there to stabilize the country. So there is a question there. How do you actually arrange for political participation when the number one priority is stability, and stability will take time? So how do you give time for the current government, the 5 years transition time, which I think is moderate compared to the average of 7 years from other civil war experiences? But also, how do you make sure that after 5 years, a democratic representative system will emerge? That's an internal challenge. I think there are some positive signs that we see. For example, within the current government that was formed, we've seen within the composition, there were 4 former regime ministers who were part of the government. There were 8, basically, who were previously with HTS. And then there were 12 who are actual civil society technocrats who've been around working on Syria, on different civil society issues. That was just in the establishment, but now as things are moving over, if you go to level 2 and level 3, the assistants, the deputies, the directors, We actually have, I'm a founding member of Madaniya and a board member of Madaniya, the largest civil society network in Syria. And one of the main problems we're facing is that we're losing civil society folks to the government, because the government is accepting everyone with a basically specialty from civil society, to the extent that we're worried, like, who's going to be there to maintain civil society. So there is also, I think, that a challenge in between. I think it is great that civil society is taking probably now like 50 or more % of the government right now. Again, not only on top level, but 2, 3, 4 levels within the management of different ministries. But there's a question, okay, how do you maintain civil society within those 4 or 5 years to come that will be able to carry the message forward? I think the third, so first we discussed transitional justice, second, democracy and civil society. I think the third and probably most important one is the issue of the unity of the country. And there are, of course, like the fault lines here between the Druze, the fault lines with the Druze project in the south and with the Kurdish project in northeast Syria. And the issue here is we have a Druze project in the south led by Hikmet al-Hijri, one of the religious leaders of the Druze, who for the last 4 or 5 years have seen that there's an opportunity in Syria for him to create a project for the Druze in Syria, basically try to attempt to create an autonomous project for the Druze, the first of its kind. But to be honest, also to try to create a project for himself. For the last 3 or 4 years, he's been presenting himself not as a religious leader of the Druze community in Syria. He's been presenting himself as the religious leader of all the Druze across the globe, which is a big title. I mean, to present. I can say, and I have like very good relationship with the Druze community in both Latin America, but also in the Levant and Lebanon, Syria. No one can really claim that title. And for al-Hijri to come forward and kind of like try to claim that title, I think he is trying to create like his own project in a sense. So how do you manage that, considering the fault lines that we mentioned? But also then, like, how do you manage the integration process of the SDF? And here it's very important. There has been negotiations between Damascus and Qamishli for the last few months, like over different issues. And perhaps here I might like disagree a little bit with Henri on like just the nature of the problem. One of the issues that have been discussed with the SDF is the issue of foreign fighters. The SDF has almost double the number of foreign fighters that HTS or the government has. So when we talk about the problem of foreign fighters among like the ranks, that problem is huge within the SDF. Of course, a lot of them are Turks, Iranians, but also a lot of Westerns basically who came and joined like the SDF. So you do have it, and in a sense, so when we talk about like a national security threat in a sense, or a cross-national security threat, that is a big one. The government has been more open in a saying that's also like an issue to discuss with Ankara. They were like, we'll propose the same solution we have for our own. Whoever wants to stay in Syria can stay in Syria, but they need to abandon weapons. They need to adopt a new life. But I think that's an issue that will have to be tackled. The other one, which is very important, and I speak here as a Kurd, which I don't always do, is how do you define which Kurdish community you are speaking on its behalf? Kurds in Syria are a large community. We're around like 4.5, and I'll end there, 4.5 or 5 million Kurds in Syria. But the majority of us came to Syria and, starting the 1400s up to the 1800s, that's around 4.9 million. The smallest community came in the early 1900s, mainly from Turkey, a little bit from Iran, when at the rise of the confrontation between Turks and Kurds and between Kurds and Armenians, that's when many Kurdish refugees basically came to Syria and settled there. So it's a question for us also as a Kurdish community. Does the Kurdish project in northeast Syria right now represent the majority of Kurds who are actually not in northeast Syria? They are in Latakia, in Hama, in Idlib, and in Damascus. Does that project represent us? For me, as a Kurd who was called, for example, by the YPG, we're called Arabized Kurds because we've been there for long, we don't speak Kurdish. That project doesn't really represent me. And I can at least speak on behalf of the Barazis, probably, like most of them, would say, no, absolutely not. We don't really find the connection there, even though it's great that someone is talking about a Kurdish project in Syria. But how representative it is, I think, is an issue that would really have to be discussed among Syrians themselves. And then, of course, Arabs in northeast Syria, which are the majority in northeast Syria, will also should have an opinion and saying on the table whether they do want to be part of a Kurdish project in northeast Syria that is purely Kurdish or not.
Well, thank you very much. So going forward, I'd like to do one more question each. I'm going to try to hold you to 2 minutes on your comments, because I do want to, at the end, have some time for question and answer. So Charles, one of the things that's fascinating is the reports of mounting tensions currently between Israeli air operations and the Turkish-backed militias near the Syrian border. How do you assess the likelihood of a direct or proxy confrontation between these two regional powers inside Syria? And within the 2 minutes, if you want to answer anything else, feel free to go. But I'm going to start my little clock right here, and I'll let you know by a little tap.
I mean, I'll be very blunt. There is no confrontation. There hasn't been a confrontation. There are no Turkish-backed militias on the Israeli border waiting for a fight. It just doesn't exist. It's a myth in Israeli media commentary. As I said in my opening remarks with the statistics, 819 Israeli air and artillery strikes, 189 ground incursions, and the occupation of 220 additional square kilometers of Syrian territory. And in a precisely same 6 months' time that happened, nothing has been directed from Syria to Israel. The Syrian transitional government, led by a controversial individual who, as Ambassador Crocker said, used to go by Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. He traces his origins to the Golan Heights. The most aggressive response he has done towards Israel is to use his ambassador at the UN Security Council to lodge a formal complaint. So there is no confrontation. I really, cannot underline that anymore. Israel seems desperate to create a confrontation, and there is a real danger that at some point down the line they will have created a self-fulfilling prophecy, but there is no intent from Syria's side of the border to have any form of confrontation. And on the Druze issue, the Israeli posture has been equally troubling. Their partners, their Druze partners that they have sought to intervene to protect, are basically a bunch of Assad regime generals who created what they have called the Druze-Sweda Military Council 1 day after Bashar al-Assad fled to Syria. That council has aligned itself with Sheikh Hikmat al-Hijri, who I met with in February, who basically told me back then there will be no deal that I will ever make between myself and the transitional government in Damascus, no matter what it looks like. So they're very much doubling down on Qutaiba's comments. But he does not represent all of the Druze community, even in Sweda. The dominant majority in Sweda, in the Druze community, have made a deal with the transitional government in Damascus, with the Interior Ministry, with their local police and security forces. So again, inserting truth and facts into the media commentary is extremely important, because the narratives that are dominating this space in the public are myths. They just simply don't exist in reality.
Thank you very much. Dani, you opened the door on the subject about Reformation. I'd like you to go a little bit deeper, because most people take a look at the Middle East and it's so religiously driven as opposed to sectarian or national identity. Can we really have that conversation?
No. No, you're not going to find, an American Jew telling the Muslims that they are in need of a reformation. Sorry.
How about Americans, though?
How about America itself? No, again, look, we're not. One of the reasons why we are so bad at this, right, where we had a much less difficult time in a much earlier generation confronting the ideology of communism, was because communism is a secular religion. We're really bad at religion. And we saw this during the Bush administration when they kept making embarrassing comments about Islam, whether they were intended to be positive or not. No, we are bad at this. I hate to admit it, but we are. And so, if there's going to be a reformation inside Islam, and I would never, I don't like that word. Reformation is a Christian phenomenon. I think there needs to be I think much more there needs to be a political reckoning between Islamists and secular Muslims who want to take the reins back for themselves from these self-appointed, not especially well-informed, not especially good Muslim leaders, who we have cycled through repeatedly over the years, and the fact that they have these the state backing question is a much more political question, right? I mean, Erdogan sees himself as the godfather of the Muslim Brotherhood. Because that's who Erdogan is. But that doesn't mean that we need to respect his self-appointed role any more than we need to respect Iran's self-appointed role as godfather of all of the Shia. Right? But these are our problems, not their problems. We love to pretend to respect these, just like I refer to this as the Loya Jirga problem, right? Everybody after 9/11 loved to talk about the Loya Jirga. It just sounds so authentic. Those people are so authentic. And it's hard to believe that a national policy is centered around the stupidity of the authenticity of the idea of a Loya Jirga. But that's it, right? I said we suck at this. We do suck at this. I do want to just take 10 seconds and push back on Charles, who has a very Damascus-centered perspective on Israel, which I understand, and I think there are lots of things to dislike in Israeli policy towards Syria, not least of which is their willingness to accommodate with the Assad regime, because, of course, the Israelis are not neoconservatives. The Israelis are Middle Easterners. But the idea that nothing is happening in Syria that should be of interest to the Israelis is absolutely ridiculous, whether it's Iran's efforts to reconstitute its own supply lines or it's the various activities of Islamist groups. The Israelis have interests there. I would only leave. Actually, Charles, if you don't mind, if I can just ask a question. One of the questions that has really arisen in my mind in the last few months is not why are the Israelis there, what are the Israelis doing? It isn't Shara a wonderful man for restraining himself in responding to the Jews. The question that has arisen in my mind is, how did they get that Eli Cohen stuff back? How did they get the body of the Israeli soldier back?
let's get.
Are they?
We have 10 minutes
there's
at the end.
There's a
You'll be
question
allowed to
at the
ask him a
end.
question then, but I want to move on to.
Can I finish my sentence, if you don't
You're already
mind?
at 4 minutes. We all have
Oh,
2
I'm so
minutes.
sorry.
Okay,
I know my colleague will forgive me, and I won't let him answer now. But are they actually secretly doing these negotiations themselves? That's it.
Okay, thank you.
I'm shutting up.
Henri, you're up.
I thought you had a question for me.
I do. You had broached the subject of the PKK. You said you were going to save your comments for later on in the presentation, and I want you to follow up on that.
So, in terms of determining Erdogan's policy towards Syria and the regime, obviously, in Syria, is what happens now that the PKK has said it's going to disband itself. Now, that's quite an important phenomenon. Obviously, the PKK started in 1984 and has continued to fight, so to say, over the years. But the PKK, I would say, in the last decade or so, was an organization that had very little in terms of impact militarily, so to say, in Turkey. The Turks had managed to, both in Syria and in Iraq, contain the PKK forces. And I would recommend the BBC documentary that was aired 2 weeks ago, where they show, just Iraq, that the Turks have 136 military bases in Iraq, all designed to contain the PKK, which is in the Kandil Mountains, which is difficult to reach. I mean, but the PKK hasn't done much in Turkey, especially since its leader, Öcalan, was in prison, and he's in prison in an island in the Marmara Sea. The Kurds knew that the PKK was done for. They had nothing to contribute. There were attempts in the past to have negotiations, but they failed. And the truth of the matter is the presence of the PKK, or the fact that PKK was alive and still called a terrorist organization, had a lot of benefits for Erdogan. Look at how people get charged in Turkey. All you have to do is say something that's critical of Erdogan. You either can go to jail because you insulted the president or because you're a terrorist. The mayor of Istanbul, who was arrested, yet is in prison still, was arrested on 2 charges: corruption and then terrorism. Terrorism is this label that they attach on everything. Now, the consequence of this deal is what the Kurds have said as part of the relinquishing the armed struggle, etc. And there is an intermediary called the DEM Party, which is Kurdish MPs, mostly Kurdish MPs, who represent in parliament the Kurdish population. The very fact that there is no terrorism threat anymore opens up a huge horizon for real political activity on the part of the Kurds. They don't have to worry about anything they do getting the terrorism sticker stuck on them. Right? It all opens up. And in fact, you see that Erdogan was not very happy about this process, which was started out paradoxically by his coalition partner, the most arch-nationalist politician you can find in Turkey, who out of the blue, even before the election here, so it wasn't in anticipation of Trump coming, that something has to be done about the Kurdish issue in Turkey. And what the DEM Party has said, and it's been reflected in the conversations with Öcalan, is that they're not asking for ethnic rights, they're not asking for even language rights, which are all long-standing issues. All they said is they want democracy. Democracy for everybody in Turkey. That everybody's will be better off if Turkey becomes democratic, and Turkey today is not democratic by any stretch of the imagination. Now, here's the thing.
Okay, so we need to give Qutaiba his time too, because we're running out of time. So could you sort of wrap
Okay,
this
just
up?
very quickly. So the important thing is that Turkish Kurds have a very, very strong affinity for Rojava, for northern Syria. The one thing they don't want is for the Turks to go into northern Syria and attack the SDF. And if they were to do that, Turkey literally would go up in flames. So that's the critical issue that, in terms of foreign policy, that is determined by domestic politics.
Thank you. The diaspora. Millions of Syrians have exiled. What role can they play? They're educated, they're skilled, they're politically engaged. What can be done to bring them back, engage in Syrian civil society and return to the homeland?
I think President Trump took the first important step, which is deciding to lift sanctions. And I think following that or attached to that needs to be a decision to remove the designation on Ahmed al-Shara and on HTS as a terrorist organization. Because under US laws, going and serving under a government led by a designated individual means you are criminally liable for providing material support. So the question is, how can you convince all the brain drain that Syria has went through in the last 15 years, probably around 10 million Syrians, how do you convince them to go back? Remove sanctions, remove designations, so they can be part of this new Syria. There are access points right now in Damascus that I think a lot of the diaspora want to engage politically, economically, through government, and many are actually engaging, especially in Europe, through at least what I would call green political lights from the governments in France, in the UK, in Germany, saying we want you to engage, we want you to go work there, regardless of the risks from the US. But I mean, many actually would prefer, especially for those who are in the Gulf and the region, they want to see actually a clearer green light from the US. So that needs to be done from the US side. again, moving with the removing or removal of designations. And again, trust and verify, or verify and trust. At the end of the day, we need to engage. And I think starting to do that from last week, I think, is a great step. I think on the other end for the diaspora, we need to give Syria some time so people can go there, can test how things are. No one is going to be able to move to Syria, for example, right now. Like, I can tell you, for people who are single, finding even like a place to live in Damascus is impossible, because basically all the outskirts of the city are just destroyed. Like, a hotel room in Damascus right now costs at least $250. That's how much the demand there is. But also, I mean, even if you decide to make the move, even set up a tent there is no school to send your children to. So that means we need to invest in actually at least building some of the critical infrastructure there, so at least Syrians, can find a place to go to, can find a school they can send their children to. We can't. I know in Washington there has been a lot of discussions the last few months. Is like, no, we will provide a general license. No, we have to wait before we remove sanctions. We have to wait before we remove designation. Well, if we do not, and again, like, I think President Trump made the decision, I don't think actually only by request, from Saudi, from Turkey, from Qatar. Actually, people around President Trump, I've received so many questions in the last 2 months from circles around President Trump, is about the economic opportunity in Syria. People were asking, how much would it cost to rebuild Syria to at least where it was in 2011, to be where it is today? What sort of critical infrastructure U.S. companies can participate in? I was surprised by the questions. With President Trump's announcements last week, I think those questions and inquiries make a lot of sense, considering what is happening in the conversations right now between Washington and Damascus. So, in addition to what has already been done, there is no way Syria can be a good place for the diaspora and the refugees to come back to help build this third or fourth republic without actual investment. And I'm saying investment, not a donation. Without an actual investment in this Syria, in its infrastructure, in rebuilding, to make sure not only it's a good place to come back, but also it's a stable place that could change the face of the region.
Thank you very much. So we've got 10 minutes. I'm going to open up the floor to questions. But before I do that, Charles, you want to answer Dani's question quickly?
Sure, yes. I mean, just very quickly. I don't know the ins and outs. I mean, Mossad said they got the body back themselves using non-Israeli assets, which obviously means Syrians. As for the documents, my understanding is that they were discovered or seized and handed over by the transitional government as a goodwill gesture, and we are in that kind of very early confidence-building phase. I would just say one point in a sort of friendly debate is, if Israel's primary security concern is Iran coming back, keep hitting the Syrian transitional government and stirring the sectarian pot, because that is the way that you get Iran back with the IRGC and Hezbollah on Syrian soil, which is why I was calling it a self-fulfilling prophecy. And of course, if they are most concerned about Iran's attempts to smuggle weapons into Syria and then through Syria to Lebanon, those should be the targets they're hitting in Israeli airstrikes, but they're not. The Syrian transitional government is seizing and intercepting those weapons shipments. They've seized over 20 of them in the last month. There's a level of either tactical or strategic calculations going on here, and there's a little bit of an imbalance, at least in my...
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
May I get just 30 seconds just to add to that very quickly? I think one major issue here is also Israel is not trying to win hearts and minds. If there is actually a good strategy to at least create a friend on the other side, Netanyahu coming on the Golan Heights on December 8th and saying, we're willing to live in peace next to Druze, Alawites, Christians, Kurds, and then Muslims, if they're willing to live in peace next to Israel, is not a message of peace. And it's not winning the hearts and minds of Syrians, if that is what the Israeli government wants on the other side.
Okay, thank you.
This has been brilliant. Thank you. One of the things that made me so proud of being an American ambassador was when other ambassadors would come up to me and say, how do you do it? You're so many religions, cultures, and you all get along. Tell me, all the elements and segments and cultures and religions in your country, in Syria, can it work? Can they get along? Can they respect each other and live in peace with each other?
I think when the country breaks down, when the national tie breaks down, everyone goes to the circle they're most familiar with. That is the family, that is the tribe, that is the religion. The idea today is that Syrians actually want to rebuild that bigger circle, that where Syria first or being Syrian comes first before anything else. And the fact that they want to invest in rebuilding that national tie, I think is a testament that this is the one that matters the most. You know, communities in Syria, last month I was having dinner with the Jewish Syrian community who are in New York. There are, I think, around 85,000 Syrian Jew, you know, around that area. And like...
Say Drew or Jew?
Jew, yeah. And I mean, they speak Damascene Arabic better than I do. I mean, I grew up in Syria, I lived there. I mean, the community has left Syria, you know, some of them for over 100 years. They're still more connected than we are. And the fact that, you know, many of them have been there, the community there met with the foreign minister when he was in New York. Absolutely, I'm absolutely hopeful, yes. If we give Syria a chance, I think Syrians are able to come back together and live in peace.
Anybody else?
Question on the Constitution. Who's the James Madison or Alexander Hamilton that's going to help them develop a Constitution? And will that Constitution provide for some type of federalism and recognition of the different ethnic groups within Syria?
I think Qutaiba would have something to say about that, but I would say to be determined. We had a very rushed, in the space of about a week, construction of what was called a constitutional declaration. As an analyst, my personal assessment is that was intended by the government as an experiment to see what the population accepted and what they kicked back upon, but they've given themselves a number of years to begin drafting a constitution. But your mentioning of federalism triggered something that I wanted to respond to earlier, which is, you know, the federalism question. Let me rewind. I spent a number of years at the peak of the Syrian fighting in 2012 to 2017. In Track 1.5 negotiations with Syrians of all stripes, from the regime to the armed opposition and everyone in between, the business community, tribal leaders, everyone. The one thing that united everyone involved in that process, and there was well over 1,000, and they were coming from inside Syria to engage in this process, the only thing that united all of them was a fear that Syria would be divided up like a cake. The word federalism only has a popularity, pretty much, in the northeast and in Sheikh Hikmat al-Hijri's office in Sweden. That's it. Beyond that, it's like a poisonous word in Syria because it triggers that emotional response of, well, it's just a slippery slope to carve up the country. And I'll just end by saying it's interesting that post-Assad's fall, the US military that could, for 10 years, never have said a bad thing about the SDF, the only reason why there is a track of negotiations between the SDF and Damascus now, and that track continues to move forward, is because the US military is basically forcing the SDF to the table in those negotiations. And I know for a fact that the CENTCOM's message to the SDF is, you guys have to make a deal, no matter what, you have to make a deal, which instantly puts them at a position of disadvantage. And that, again, is, I think, CENTCOM's recognition that the idea of federalism isn't necessarily the best path forward for Syria. So that doesn't mean that some form of administrative decentralization isn't going to be the reality, and it almost certainly is. But the word federalism and actually having different official zones of the country isn't, I think, the best way forward.
Thank you.
Well, let me add my voice to John's to thank a magnificent panel for a wonderful, I think, illuminating morning, and to share with them a little token of our appreciation, which I hope will be a memento of today. In Charles's case, something new for your collection. In Dani's case, this can keep company with the others that you have crowding each other off your shelves. Henri, a little token of our thanks, and Qutaiba, again,
Thank you, sir.
Our thanks to you, and a round of applause for an unparalleled collection of experts.